The Phillip mansion had never known terror like this. 15 of the world's most brilliant physicians crowded into a medical suite that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie rather than a home. Their pristine white coats moved in frantic choreography under lighting that cost more than most families earn in a year. Cardiac monitors wailed. Ventilators gasped. A team from Johns Hopkins shouted contradictory orders at specialists flown in from Tokyo, while a pediatric surgeon whose textbook was used in every medical school stood frozen, staring at results that defied everything she'd been taught. "We're losing her," someone whispered, and the words fell like a death sentence. Baby Sophia Phillip was dying, and the only person who could save her was the one person no one would ever listen to, the cook's daughter who'd spent her whole life being invisible. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because what happens next will leave you breathless. You don't want to miss this. Baby Sophia Phillip, 3-month-old heiress to a $63 billion tech empire, was dying. Her tiny body had turned an unnatural shade of blue-gray, her breathing shallow and irregular, a mysterious rash spreading across her chest like dark storm clouds. Every scan came back normal. Every blood test revealed nothing. Every treatment, and they'd tried everything money could manufacture, failed completely. Through the kitchen window, face pressed against glass that her own mother had cleaned just that morning, stood Juliet. 14 years old, daughter of the night shift cook, wearing a jacket 2 sizes too small and sneakers held together with duct tape and desperate prayers. She'd spent her entire life being invisible in this mansion. The girl who restocked pantries, who carried laundry baskets up back staircases, who'd learned to make herself so small, so quiet, so forgettable that the wealthy people floating through their marble paradise never had to be reminded she existed. Right now, she was staring at something every genius in that room had missed. The flowers. The stunning white and purple arrangement sitting on the prep counter near where they mixed Sophia's formula. The one that had arrived yesterday with congratulations from a dear friend. The one the head chef had carelessly moved aside, its delicate petals brushing against the sterilized bottles lined up like soldiers. Juliet's hands trembled against the cold glass. She knew those flowers. Her abuela, her grandmother who'd raised half of San Juan's poorest neighborhood with nothing but prayers and plant knowledge, had grabbed Juliet's wrist in a garden 7 years ago, yanking her hand away from those exact blooms. Adelpha Mija. Oleander. Beautiful as angels, deadly as demons. Every part kills. Even the water it sits in can stop a beating heart. The doctors were wheeling Sophia toward an operating room. They were going to cut that baby open, searching for answers buried in her organs. The answer was sitting 3 feet from her bottles, poisoning everything it touched. Juliet looked at her mother through the door, Rosa, who'd worked 18-hour days for 9 years, who'd raised Juliet alone, who'd warned her 1,000 times. Stay invisible, Mija. Don't give them reasons. We need this job. She thought about what would happen if she was wrong. Then she thought about what would happen if she was right and said nothing. Juliet pulled her thin jacket tight, whispered a prayer her abuela had taught her, and ran. What would you risk to save a life that the world says isn't your business to save? Juliet had learned to move through the Phillip mansion like a shadow by the time she was 8 years old. It wasn't a skill her mother taught her. It was survival instinct, coded into her DNA the moment they'd moved into the converted garage apartment at the edge of the estate. When your mother cooked gourmet meals for people who ate on plates worth more than your entire month's rent, when you attended the elite Riverside Preparatory Academy only because Catherine Phillip thought sponsoring one scholarship student made for good PR photos, when you lived in a space so small you could touch both walls with your arms spread wide, you learned quickly that your existence was conditional. Tolerated, not welcomed. You learned to move like smoke, to breathe like a whisper, to become so utterly forgettable that the wealthy people gliding through their marble lives never had to be inconvenienced by the reminder that you were alive. Her mother, Rosa Martinez, had worked for the Phillip family for 9 years. She'd started when Juliet was just 5, chopping vegetables in an industrial kitchen while wealthy dinner guests laughed in rooms she wasn't allowed to enter. She'd worked through migraines that made her vision blur, through the arthritis that made her hands ache, through the slow erosion of every dream she'd once had for herself. Also, Juliet could have a roof and food and maybe, just maybe, a chance at something better. "We are blessed, Mija," Rosa would tell her daughter every night, her voice soft with exhaustion and something that might have been faith or might have been denial. "Mr. Phillip pays for your school. We have a place to live. We are blessed, Juliet. Never forget that." Juliet never argued. But she also never forgot the way Catherine Phillips' friends looked through her at charity galas when she served hors d'oeuvres. Never forgot the time John Phillip had fired a gardener for accidentally making eye contact with him during an important phone call. Never forgot the sign on the service entrance. Staff must use rear access only. No exceptions. Blessed. Sure. If you're already hooked on Juliet's story, you won't want to miss what happens next. The stakes are about to get impossibly high. The Phillip estate sprawled across 52 acres of manicured perfection in the hills overlooking the bay. There were gardens designed by the same landscape architect who'd done the Getty Museum. Fountains imported from Tuscany that cost more than most people's houses. A tennis court where celebrities practiced. A helipad where executives landed. A swimming pool with an infinity edge that seemed to pour into the sky itself. There was a 10-car garage filled with vehicles Juliet had only seen in magazines. A wine cellar that held bottles older than her abuela would have been if she'd lived. A home theater with seats that cost $8,000 each. Juliet knew every inch of it. Not because she was allowed to explore, God no. She knew it because she'd spent 9 years watching from the margins. From the small window of the garage apartment where she did homework on a wobbly table. From behind hedges when she walked to the bus stop for school. From the shadows of service corridors when she snuck through to bring her mother-forgotten lunch. She'd mapped the estate in her mind the way other kids memorized video game levels. She knew which security cameras had blind spots. She knew which doors were left unlocked during the 2 p.m. shift change when guards rotated posts. She knew that the head of security, a former Marine named Daniels, took exactly one 15-minute break every afternoon at 3:45 to call his daughter at college. She knew these things because knowing them made her feel like she had some small measure of power in a world that constantly reminded her she had none. But lately, Juliet had been watching for a different reason. For months ago, Catherine Phillip had given birth to a baby girl. Sophia Grace Phillip. The princess. The heir. The future of a dynasty built on cybersecurity patents and venture capital investments, and the kind of generational wealth that most people couldn't even conceptualize. The baby had arrived in a hurricane of magazine covers and society page announcements. A celebrity photographer had been hired to capture her first moments. A team of night nurses rotated in 8-hour shifts. A lactation consultant had been flown in from Sweden to ensure optimal feeding schedules. Juliet had watched it all from her usual place, the shadows. And somewhere along the way, something had shifted in her chest. She'd started timing her walks to school, so she'd pass the nursery window at sunrise, when the morning nurse would hold Sophia up to see the light breaking over the bay. She'd started lingering near the kitchen entrance when she knew the baby would be taken for her afternoon stroll through the rose gardens. She'd started feeling something she couldn't quite name, a strange, aching tenderness for this tiny person who had everything Juliet would never have, but who also seemed so small, so fragile, so utterly unaware of the crown she'd been born wearing. Maybe it was because babies were innocent. Maybe it was because Juliet remembered what her abuela used to say in Spanish. Every child comes into this world pure, Mija. What happens after that? That's on us. Or maybe it was because Juliet understood, in some bone-deep way, that she and Sophia were both prisoners of circumstances they hadn't chosen. Sophia would spend her life in a golden cage, performing for cameras and investors, and a father who saw her as a legacy rather than a person. Juliet would spend her life in the margins, invisible and uncounted, her potential measured only by how well she stayed out of the way. 2 girls, 2 prisons, same estate. This story is about to take a turn you won't see coming. What Juliet discovers will change everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Juliet first saw the flowers. She was walking home from the bus stop, taking her usual route along the service road that ran behind the mansion's west wing. The autumn air smelled like jasmine and expensive lawn treatments. Juliet had her thin jacket zipped up despite the California warmth. The same jacket she'd been wearing for 2 years, with the frayed cuffs and the broken zipper pull that her mother kept promising to replace but never had time for. A delivery van was parked near the service entrance. This wasn't unusual. The Phillips received deliveries constantly. Everything from organic produce flown in from Japan to custom furniture from Italian artisans to cases of wine that cost more per bottle than Rosa, made in a week. But something about this delivery made Juliet slow her steps. The delivery man was carrying flowers. They were breathtaking. Juliet had to admit it. an elaborate arrangement in a crystal vase, easily 3 feet tall. White blooms with delicate pink centers, interspersed with clusters of pale purple flowers that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Long, elegant leaves that shimmered with an almost waxy sheen. The whole arrangement was wrapped in silver ribbon, and a card was tucked among the stems. Marco, the head chef, met the delivery man at the door. Juliet watched from behind the oleander bushes, the irony, she would think later, as Marco signed for the package. His tattooed hands reached out to steady the vase, and Juliet saw him brush against the flowers as he adjusted his grip. And then she saw it. When Marco's fingers pulled away, they glistened. Just slightly. A faint residue, clear and slightly sticky like sap, but something about it looked wrong. Felt wrong. Marco noticed it too. Juliet saw him frown, wiping his hands on his chef's whites, rubbing his fingers together with a puzzled expression. But then the delivery man said something and Marco laughed, and the moment passed. He carried the flowers inside, presumably toward the kitchen, where they prepared Sophia's specialized formula every 3 hours like clockwork, and Juliet was left standing in the shadows with an unease coiling in her stomach like a snake. She knew those flowers. She couldn't remember from exactly where. Not at first. But something about those blooms, those leaves, that waxy residue, it tugged at a memory buried deep in her mind. Her abuela's voice, sharp with warning. It had been a summer in Puerto Rico, 7 years ago. The last summer before her grandmother died. They'd been walking through the garden behind Abuela's tiny concrete house in Catano, and Juliet had reached out to touch a flowering bush, drawn by its beauty. Her abuela had grabbed her wrist so hard it hurt. No, Mija. Never touch the adelpha. You see how pretty. That's how the devil works. Wraps poison in beautiful packages. This one, every part kills. The leaves, the flowers, the stems. Even the water in the vase. You touch it, you touch your mouth, your heart stops. You understand me. Juliet had understood. She'd never forgotten. And now those exact flowers were sitting in the Philip kitchen, right where they prepared baby Sophia's bottles. Juliet stood there for a long moment, that unease growing heavier with every breath. She thought about going to find her mother. She thought about knocking on the service entrance and telling someone, anyone, that something about those flowers felt dangerous. But who would listen to her? She was nobody. The cook's daughter. The scholarship charity case. She didn't even exist in the Phillips world, except as a line item on their taxes and a smiling brown face in their foundation's promotional materials. So Juliet did what she always did. She swallowed her instincts, buried her unease, and walked back to the garage apartment to start her homework. 48 hours later, she would realize that decision almost cost a baby her life. The sirens came at sunset. Juliet was sitting at the cramped table they used for everything, eating, homework, her mother's meal planning, working through an AP biology problem about cellular respiration that suddenly seemed impossibly trivial when she heard them. Distant at first, then growing louder, closer, more urgent. She went to the window and watched as 2 ambulances came screaming up the private drive, followed by a convoy of black Mercedes and a helicopter that descended onto the north lawn like something from a movie. Her mother burst through the apartment door minutes later, her face drained of color, her hands shaking as she reached for her chef's coat. "Something's wrong with the baby," Rosa gasped in Spanish, her accent thickening the way it always did when she was scared. "Something terrible. They're calling doctors from everywhere. I have to go. I have to help. They need everyone." She was gone before Juliet could say a word. Juliet stood at the window for hours that night, watching the mansion blaze with lights. Watching figures in white coats rush back and forth past the nursery windows. Watching the shadows of crisis dance across the perfectly manicured lawns. And deep in her gut, beneath the fear and confusion and the strange grief she felt for a baby she'd never even held, one thought kept surfacing like a body in dark water. The flowers. The flowers. The flowers. The Phillip mansion had transformed into a war zone. Juliet had never seen anything like it. Security had tripled, but they were all focused on the perimeter, on keeping news vans and curious neighbors away from the crisis. No one was watching the service areas. No one was monitoring the blind spots Juliet had memorized over 9 years of invisible existence. She'd slipped through the hedge maze, moved along the garden wall, and positioned herself behind the fountain. The massive Italian marble fountain with the angels, where she had a direct sight line into the nursery's floor-to-ceiling windows. What she saw made her blood freeze. Baby Sophia, tiny, precious Sophia, who Juliet had watched learn to track faces with those bright eyes, was the color of a storm cloud. Her small body lay in the center of a medical hurricane, surrounded by more equipment than Juliet had ever seen outside of a TV hospital drama. Tubes snaked from her arms like transparent vines. Monitors tracked heartbeats that stuttered and skipped like a scratched CD. And her skin, God, her skin was this terrible grayish blue, mottled with a rash that seemed to spread, even as Juliet watched, creeping across her tiny chest like spilled ink. She looked like she was dying. She looked like she was already dead and just hadn't realized it yet. The doctors had arrived in waves. Juliet had counted them. Black cars and helicopters delivering an army of medical royalty onto the Phillip estate like generals being summoned to a losing war. She'd heard the nurses whispering their names in awed tones as they rushed past. Dr. Patricia Chun from Stanford Medical, the pediatric cardiologist who'd saved that senator's grandson. Dr. James Morrison from Mass General, his waiting list was 2 years long. Dr. Aisha Okafor from Johns Hopkins, the immunologist who'd been featured on 60 Minutes. Dr. Rafael Santos, Dr. Jennifer Kim, Dr. David Goldstein, Dr. Sarah Patel. 15 of them. 15 of the greatest medical minds in the country. Each one carrying degrees from institutions Juliet could never dream of attending, even with her straight A's and perfect test scores. Each one armed with knowledge that had taken decades and hundreds of thousands of dollars to acquire. 15 experts. And not a single answer. Juliet could see them through the window, arguing now. Dr. Chin was gesturing emphatically at a tablet while Dr. Morrison shook his head. Dr. Okafor had stepped back from the group, arms crossed, expression troubled. A younger doctor, Juliet didn't know his name, was running another blood test while a nurse changed another bag. They were lost. Juliet could see it in their body language, in the way their confident postures had begun to crumble as the hours passed. These titans of medicine, these gods in white coats, were standing in a multi-million-dollar nursery with every resource on earth at their disposal. And they had no idea why a 3-month-old baby was dying in front of them. John Phillip stood in the corner of the room. Juliet had never seen the tech billionaire look so broken. The man who commanded boardrooms and crushed competitors, who'd built a cybersecurity empire from nothing, who moved through the world like he owned it, which in many ways he did, was clutching his wife's hand with white-knuckled desperation. Catherine Phillip hadn't stopped crying for hours. Her designer dress was wrinkled. Her perfect makeup was destroyed. Her society page composure was shattered into a million pieces on the Italian marble floor. Their baby was dying, and all their billions couldn't save her. If you're not on the edge of your seat right now, you're not paying attention. What happens next will shock you. Juliet watched the doctors cycle through their theories. Bacterial infection. They pumped Sophia full of broad-spectrum antibiotics that did absolutely nothing. Viral inflammation. They tried antivirals that made no difference whatsoever. Autoimmune response. They administered immunosuppressants that didn't suppress anything. Genetic disorder. They ran sequencing tests that came back maddeningly inconclusive. Severe allergic reaction. They injected epinephrine that might as well have been water. Each theory emerged with confidence and collapsed in confusion. Each treatment was administered with precision and failed with cruelty. Juliet watched it all through the window, her hands pressed against the cold marble of the fountain, her heart hammering against her ribs. Because she knew something they didn't. She knew about the flowers. They were still there. She could see them from where she crouched, now positioned on a table near the formula prep station. Someone had moved them closer to make room for medical equipment. The beautiful white and purple blooms caught the harsh LED lights, the leaves shimmering with that waxy coating. The doctors walked past them constantly. They set coffee cups down next to them. They adjusted equipment around them. They spread medical charts beside them. The flowers were invisible to them, part of the background decoration. Just like Juliet. She remembered her abuela's lessons now, the memories surfacing with painful clarity. They'd been sitting on abuela's concrete porch in Catania, the summer Juliet was 7. Her grandmother had been showing her pictures in an old book with a cracked leather spine, a book of medicinal and poisonous plants that had belonged to Juliet's great-great-grandmother. This one here, abuela had said, pointing to an illustration that looked almost exactly like the flowers in the Phillip kitchen. We call it Adelpha. The doctors call it oleander, Nerium oleander. Beautiful, yes? But Mija, listen to me. Every part of this plant is poison. The leaves, the flowers, the stems, the roots. The sap on the outside, it has toxins called cardiac glycosides. Just touching it, and then touching your mouth can make your heart beat wrong. And if you're small, if you're a baby. She'd shaken her head slowly, her weathered hands trembling. Even breathing the air around it too long, if the flowers are inside where the air doesn't move, it can poison the blood, make the heart slow down, then speed up, then stop. The skin turns blue. Rashes appear. The child looks like they're dying from inside, but really the poison is outside in the air they breathe. Juliet's abuela had known things that no medical school taught. She'd learned her healing arts from her mother, who'd learned from her mother, who'd learned from ancestors who'd had nothing but the plants around them and the wisdom passed down through generations of survival. She'd delivered babies in homes with no electricity. She'd cured fevers with bark and leaves when there was no money for doctors. She'd saved lives with knowledge that fancy physicians dismissed as folklore, as superstition, as the quaint beliefs of uneducated old women. But her abuela had been anything but uneducated. She'd possessed a PhD from the University of Survival, a master's degree in paying attention, a doctorate in remembering what killed and what healed. And she'd taught Juliet. Not everything. She died of a stroke when Juliet was 8, leaving her with fragments of that vast knowledge rattling around in her head like seeds in a dried gourd. But she'd taught her enough. Enough to recognize the shape of those leaves. Enough to remember the warning about the waxy residue. Enough to understand with growing horror what she was watching happen to baby Sophia. The doctors were looking for something inside the baby. They were scanning her blood for invaders, probing her organs for defects, searching her DNA for errors. They were looking in the wrong place. She watched Dr. Chen call a conference in the corner of the nursery, gathering the other 14 physicians into a cluster of expensive suits and grave expressions. Juliet couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could read their body language, the head shakes, the spread hands, the defeat settling over them like ash. They were giving up. No, not giving up. Preparing. Juliet saw one of the doctors motion toward the door, toward wherever they'd set up an operating room. She saw another doctor begin prepping what looked like surgical instruments on a sterile tray. They were going to cut that baby open. They were going to perform exploratory surgery on Sophia's tiny body, searching for an answer that wasn't there. And the surgery itself, the anesthesia, the trauma, the stress on her already failing system, would push her past the point of no return. Sophia would die on an operating table, surrounded by 15 useless degrees. Juliet's hands curled into fists. She thought about her mother, about what would happen to Rosa if Juliet did what she was thinking about doing. Her mother would lose her job, that was certain. They'd be thrown off the estate, probably prosecuted for trespassing, maybe worse. Everything Rosa had sacrificed for 9 years would be destroyed because her daughter couldn't keep her head down and stay invisible like she was supposed to. She thought about herself, about how easy it would be to just walk away, to go back to the garage apartment and pretend she hadn't seen anything, hadn't understood anything. She was nobody. The cook's kid. The charity case. What happened to Billionaire's babies wasn't her problem. Wasn't her business. She could keep her head down, finish high school, maybe get into college on scholarship, make something of her life without taking this insane risk. She thought about her abuela, about the way her grandmother had looked at her when she taught her about plants, about healing, about the knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Puerto Rican women who'd had nothing but each other and the earth beneath their feet and the wisdom of survival. This knowledge is your inheritance, Mija, abuela had told her. Not money, not land, not fancy titles. This, what I'm putting in your head right now. This is what they can never take from you. Promise me you'll use it when it matters. When someone needs you. Promise me. Juliet had promised. And then she'd spent years being ashamed of that inheritance. Being embarrassed by the grandmother who'd never learned English, who'd spoken with an accent that made people assume she was ignorant, who'd healed with herbs and prayers when real doctors used machines and pharmaceuticals. Juliet had wanted to be modern, sophisticated, American. She'd wanted to be anything other than the descendant of colonized people who'd had to figure out their own medicine because no one in power would help them. But right now, in this moment, that inheritance was the only thing that could save Sophia's life. And Juliet was the only one who carried it. What would you do? Would you risk everything, your home, your mother's livelihood, your entire future, for a baby whose family has never even acknowledged your existence? Would you step out of the shadows, knowing you might never be able to hide in them again? Juliet is about to make her choice. And nothing will ever be the same. Juliet looked at the nursery window one more time. Sophia's monitors were flatlining. The doctors were rushing now, shouting orders, preparing for emergency surgery that Juliet knew in her bones would kill the baby faster than the poison already in her system. She thought about what her abuela would do. And then Juliet stood up from behind the fountain, stepped out of the shadows that had hidden her for 9 years, and started running toward the mansion. She had no plan, no strategy, no idea how she was going to get past security, past the doctors, past John Philip himself. She only knew that she had to try. That if she walked away now and that baby died, she would carry the weight of it forever. That some things mattered more than staying safe, more than staying invisible, more than protecting a life that wasn't really living anyway. Her feet pounded against the manicured grass. The evening air burned her lungs. Somewhere behind her, a security guard shouted in surprise. Juliet didn't stop. She was done being a shadow. Juliet hit the service entrance at full speed. The door was unlocked. Thank God for small mercies and distracted staff. And she burst through it into the controlled chaos of the industrial kitchen. Sous chefs who'd been prepping for a dinner that would never happen stood frozen at their stations, their faces pale with reflected anxiety from the medical crisis happening upstairs. A pastry chef dropped a copper mixing bowl with a clang that echoed through the marble halls. Someone screamed. Juliet didn't stop. She knew this house. She'd memorized every corridor, every shortcut, every back stairway that the family never used, but the staff traveled daily. Her feet carried her through the kitchen, past the walk-in refrigerators, toward the narrow service staircase that wound up to the second floor like a secret spine hidden inside the mansion's gilded body. Hey, stop right there. Daniels, the head of security. Juliet heard his heavy combat boots thundering behind her, heard the crackle of his radio as he called for backup. But Juliet was smaller, faster, and desperate in a way that Daniels, former Marine, father of 2, comfortable in his authority, couldn't possibly understand. She took the stairs 3 at a time, her worn sneakers slipping on the polished wood, her hand gripping the railing so hard her knuckles screamed. Second floor. West wing. The nursery was at the end of the hall, past the family portraits of Philip ancestors and the antique vases that cost more than her mother made in a year and the silk wallpaper imported from France. 2 more security guards appeared at the top of the stairs. Juliet's heart seized. They were big, both of them, with shoulders like linebackers and expressions that said they'd been waiting their whole careers for a chance to tackle someone. They spread out, blocking the hallway, arms extended like they were herding cattle. "Young lady, you need to stop right now," one of them said, his voice carrying that false calm that adults used when they were about to get violent. "You're trespassing on private property. Whatever's going on, we can talk about it, but you need to." Juliet feinted left. The guard bit. He lunged in that direction, his massive body committed to the movement. And Juliet spun right, ducking under the second guard's grasping arms with a move she'd learned dodging bullies in the school hallway. Years of being underestimated finally paying off. She felt fingers brush her jacket, that old, worn jacket with the broken zipper, and then she was past them, sprinting down the corridor toward the nursery door. Juliet is fighting for her life and Sophia's. But the hardest part hasn't even started yet. What happens next will leave you breathless. The nursery door was closed. Juliet could hear voices on the other side, urgent, overlapping medical jargon she didn't fully understand, mixed with the steady electronic wail of machines losing their battle. She didn't knock. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the handle and threw the door open with enough force to send it crashing against the wall. 15 heads turned toward her. 15 faces registered shock, then confusion, then outrage. The room smelled like antiseptic and fear and something else, something sweet and faintly floral and wrong. The flowers. Their poison was in the air itself, had been slowly saturating the nursery for days. What the hell? Security. Security. Who is this kid? Get her out of here. The voices crashed over her like waves. But Juliet's eyes were fixed on one thing only. The crib in the center of the room, surrounded by machines and monitors and people in white coats who'd already started to turn back to their work, dismissing her as a minor disruption to be handled by others. Sophia lay in that crib. Her tiny chest was barely moving. Her skin had gone from blue to gray, like a winter sky right before snow. The rash had spread across her entire torso now, an angry constellation of raised welts that the doctors had biopsied and tested and analyzed without understanding. She was dying. Minutes now. Maybe less. John Philip stepped forward, his face a mask of grief and rage and desperate confusion. "Who are you?" His voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "How did you get in here?" "Guards, get this girl out of my daughter's room." Immediately. The guards were already on her. Juliet felt hands grip her shoulders, rough, angry hands that didn't care about being gentle. Felt herself being lifted off her feet. Felt the world tilting as they started to drag her backward toward the door. "The flowers!" Juliet screamed, fighting against the grip with everything she had. "It's the flowers. The ones on the prep table. They're oleander. They're poison." The guards didn't stop. Of course they didn't stop. She was just a kid. A poor kid. A brown girl in a worn jacket, screaming nonsense in a room full of the greatest medical minds in the world. Why would anyone listen to her? "Please." Juliet's voice cracked, broke, reformed into something raw and pleading. "My grandmother, she taught me about plants. Those flowers are adelpha. Oleander. Every part is toxic. The sap has cardiac glycosides. Sophia's been breathing it for days. You have to get them out of here. You have to. Remove her," John Philip said coldly. "Now. This is the moment that separates the ordinary from the extraordinary. What Juliet does next will haunt you." Something inside Juliet snapped. Not broke, snapped. Like a rubber band stretched past its limit. Like a bone pushed beyond what it could bear. She'd spent her entire life being invisible. Being quiet. Being good. She'd swallowed her voice 1,000 times, bitten back her opinions, made herself so small that the wealthy and powerful wouldn't be troubled by her existence. And where had it gotten her? Here. Being dragged out of a room by security guards while a baby died because no one would listen to the cook's daughter. Juliet went limp in the guard's arms. A trick she'd learned from watching a nature documentary about how prey animals sometimes play dead to confuse predators. The guard's grip loosened just slightly, their bodies adjusting to what they thought was surrender. Then Juliet twisted. She dropped her weight suddenly, slipping downward through their grasp like water through fingers. Her elbow caught one guard in the stomach, not hard enough to really hurt, but hard enough to surprise. She scrambled forward on hands and knees, moving faster than they could react, weaving between the legs of startled doctors. Someone grabbed her ankle. She kicked free. Someone else blocked her path. She rolled sideways. The room erupted into chaos. Doctors shouting. Guards cursing. Equipment crashing as people stumbled into machines. But Juliet had eyes only for the crib. For the tiny gray figure lying still as death inside it. She reached the crib. Her hands closed around Sophia's small body. So light, so terribly light, like holding a bundle of dry leaves, and she lifted the baby against her chest. Sophia's head lolled against Juliet's shoulder. Her breathing was so shallow Juliet could barely feel it. "Put her down." John Philip's voice had gone beyond rage into something primal, something animal. "Put my daughter down right now, or I swear to God." But Juliet was already moving. Not toward the door, the guards had that blocked. Toward the bathroom. The attached bathroom that she knew existed because she'd seen the blueprints once, left carelessly on the kitchen counter by an architect doing renovations. She made it through the door and slammed it behind her, fumbling with the lock as bodies crashed against the wood. The door shuttered but held. It wouldn't hold for long. These weren't security doors, they were designer doors meant to look pretty, and the guards would break through in seconds. Juliet looked around the bathroom wildly. Marble counters. Gold fixtures. A cabinet full of luxury baby products that cost more than her mother made in a month. And there, on the counter, a small jar of activated charcoal powder. The kind wealthy parents bought for natural baby care, for DIY face masks and teeth whitening and detox smoothies they read about in wellness magazines. Her abuela's voice echoed in her memory. Charcoal pulls poison from the body, Mija. The old people, they used to burn wood and grind it up for exactly this. It binds to the toxins like a magnet, carries them out before they can do more damage. The door shuttered again. Wood splintered. Juliet moved on instinct now, operating on knowledge that lived in her bones rather than her brain. She grabbed the charcoal powder with one hand while cradling Sophia with the other. She turned on the faucet, cold water, because she didn't have time to wait for warm, and wet her fingers. Sophia's eyes fluttered open, glassy, unfocused, but alive. Still alive. "I'm sorry," Juliet whispered in Spanish, the language of her grandmother, the language of prayer. I'm so sorry, Pequena. This is going to feel weird, but I promise I'm trying to help you. I promise. She mixed the charcoal with water in her palm, creating a thin black paste. She tilted Sophia's head back gently, carefully, the way she'd seen her abuela do with sick children in Catania when she'd administered her remedies. The door exploded inward. This is it. The moment of truth. Everything Juliet has risked comes down to the next few seconds. Juliet got the charcoal mixture into Sophia's mouth just as the guards reached her. Hands grabbed her from every direction, rough, angry hands that didn't care about being gentle anymore. She felt her arm twist painfully behind her back, felt her knees hit the cold marble floor, felt the baby being torn from her grasp. No, Juliet screamed. Don't wipe her mouth. Don't make her throw up. The charcoal needs time to work. Please, please, just give it 5 minutes. But no one was listening. John Philip was cradling his daughter now, his face twisted with fury and terror. The doctors were swarming, checking Sophia's vitals, examining the black residue around her tiny mouth. Catherine Philip had collapsed against the doorframe, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. What did you give her? Dr. Chin demanded, grabbing Juliet by the collar. What did you put in that baby's mouth? Activated charcoal. Juliet gasped. The guard's knee was on her back now, pressing her into the cold marble floor, making it hard to breathe. Just charcoal. It's not dangerous. It absorbs toxins. My grandmother used to. Your grandmother? Dr. Morrison's voice dripped with contempt. You assaulted a critically ill infant based on your grandmother's folk remedies? The flowers, Juliet said desperately, tasting blood where she'd bitten her lip. Please, just test the flowers. The white and purple ones on the prep table. They're oleander. Nerium oleander. The sap contains cardiac glycosides, oleandrin and nerine. They've been poisoning her for days through skin contact and inhalation. The charcoal will help bind what's already in her system, but you have to get those flowers out of here or she'll keep getting worse. Please, I'm begging you. Just test the flowers. No one moved. And then, her colors changing. It was Dr. Okafor. She was standing closest to John Philip, closest to Sophia, and her voice carried that particular quality of scientific observation that cut through chaos like a scalpel. What? John Philip looked down at his daughter. Her color, Dr. Okafor repeated slowly, her Nigerian-British accent precise. Look, she's pinking up. Her oxygen saturation is rising. Silence fell over the bathroom like a held breath. Juliet couldn't see Sophia from her position on the floor, but she could see the faces of the doctors. She watched shock replace skepticism, watched confusion replace contempt, watched 15 world-renowned physicians realize that something impossible was happening. That's not possible, Dr. Morrison said flatly. Activated charcoal can't work that fast. There's no mechanism by which. Her heart rhythm is stabilizing, Dr. Okafor interrupted, pulling out a portable monitor and pressing it to Sophia's tiny chest. Sinus rhythm normalizing. Blood pressure coming up. QT interval shortening. This is consistent with cardiac glycoside poisoning being actively treated. The rash, Catherine Philip whispered. Oh my God, look at the rash. Juliet couldn't see, but she heard the collective gasp that told her everything. The angry welts were fading. The poison that had been strangling Sophia's system was being bound, neutralized, pulled away by simple black powder that Juliet's abuela had kept in her kitchen cabinet next to the flour and the sugar. Get off her, John Philip said quietly. The guard's knee pressed harder into Juliet's back. I said get off her. John Philip's voice was different now. The rage was gone, replaced by something Juliet couldn't identify. Get off that girl right now. The pressure on Juliet's spine released. She stayed where she was for a moment, afraid to move, afraid to hope. Then slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up to her knees. John Philip was staring at her. Sophia was staring at her too. The baby's eyes were clear now, focused, tracking Juliet's face with something that might have been recognition. The flowers, Juliet said one more time, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, just test the flowers. Dr. Chin walked out of the bathroom. 2 minutes later, Juliet heard her shout from the prep area. Get a hazmat team in here now. Everyone who touched those flowers needs to scrub their hands immediately. Someone call poison control. I need everything they have on oleander toxicity. And for God's sake, get those flowers out of this house. Juliet closed her eyes. It was over. One way or another, it was over. Sophia was going to live. and Juliet had no idea what was going to happen to her next. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of fluorescent lights and hushed voices. Juliet sat in a chair outside the nursery. Not in the servants' quarters. Not in the security office. Not in a police interrogation room. A chair right there in the hallway, where anyone walking past could see her. Where John Philip had personally told her to wait. No one had put her in handcuffs. No one had called the police. No one had dragged her off the property or threatened to press charges or done any of the things Juliet had been certain would happen the moment she'd crashed through that service entrance. Instead, they brought her water, a sandwich, a blanket when one of the nurses noticed she was shivering. She didn't understand any of it. Through the nursery doorway, she could see Sophia sleeping peacefully in her crib. The baby's color had returned to normal, warm brown skin instead of that terrible deathly gray. Her monitors beeped steadily now, tracking vital signs that climbed stronger with every passing hour. The army of doctors had thinned to just 4, running final tests, conferring in low voices, occasionally glancing toward the hallway where Juliet sat wrapped in a blanket that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. Dr. Okafor had been the first to apologize. She'd come out of the nursery around midnight, her face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like shame. She'd stood in front of Juliet's chair, looked at her for a long moment, and then did something unexpected. She bowed her head. "I was wrong," she said simply, her voice soft. "We were all wrong. You saw what we couldn't see. You saved that child's life when 15 of us, with all our training, all our equipment, all our arrogance, couldn't figure out what was killing her." She paused. "I'm sorry we didn't listen." Juliet hadn't known what to say. She'd mumbled something. "Thank you, maybe, or it's okay." And Dr. Okafor had nodded once and walked away. The investigation began before dawn. John Philip had called in a private forensics team. Not regular security, but former FBI agents and toxicology specialists who arrived in unmarked vehicles and set up a command center in the mansion's east wing. Juliet watched them work through the windows, unpacking equipment, photographing the nursery, carefully removing the flower arrangement in a sealed biohazard container. Around 6 a.m., a woman in a dark suit approached Juliet's chair. "Mr. Philip wants to speak with you," she said, her voice neutral, professional. "Are you up for that?" Juliet's stomach tightened. This was it. The moment when gratitude would end and reality would begin. The moment when John Philip would remember that Juliet was still a trespasser, still a nobody, still the cook's daughter who'd broken into his home and put her hands on his infant daughter without permission. "Yes, ma'am," Juliet said. Because what else could she say? The woman led her down the corridor, past the family portraits Juliet had sprinted past hours earlier, past the servant staircase where she'd dodged the guards, past 100 small reminders of the invisible barriers she'd spent 9 years never crossing. John Philip was waiting in his study. Juliet had never been inside this room. She'd glimpsed it through doorways, seen the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the massive desk made from reclaimed wood, the windows that overlooked the bay. But standing here now, surrounded by more wealth than her entire extended family would earn in 10 lifetimes, she felt smaller than she'd ever felt before. "Sit down, Juliet." It was the first time John Philip had ever said her name. Juliet sat. John Philip looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in a single night. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot with exhaustion and something deeper. Something that looked like the shattering of everything he'd believed about his own power. He was holding a folder in his hands, thick with papers, and his fingers trembled slightly as he turned the pages. "The flowers," John began slowly, "were a gift. They arrived 2 days ago with a card congratulating Catherine and me on Sophia's 4-month milestone." He paused, his jaw tightening. The card was signed with admiration and best wishes, TM. Juliet didn't recognize the initials, but she saw the way John's hands clenched. "Thomas Mitchell," John said, and his voice was barely human anymore. "My former partner. We built Philip Secure together, 15 years ago, working out of a WeWork space in San Francisco. He was my best man, Sophia's godfather. I trusted him with everything." John's voice cracked on the last word. "My company, my family, my daughter." Juliet sat very still, not knowing what to say. "Do you know what the worst part is?" John continued. "The doctors would never have figured it out. Never. They were so focused on their blood tests and imaging scans and genetic sequencing. So certain that the answer had to be something complex, something that matched their training, that they never once looked around the room. Never once asked what had changed in Sophia's environment. Never once considered that the simplest explanation might be the right one. He looked at Juliet with something that might have been wonder. But you did. Juliet shifted uncomfortably. My abuela taught me about plants. She said that doctors with expensive degrees always look for expensive problems. Sometimes the answer is just sitting there in front of everyone. Your abuela sounds like a wise woman. She was, Juliet said, and her throat tightened. She died when I was 8. She was going to teach me more, but she ran out of time. John nodded slowly. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the folder, at the evidence of betrayal by someone he'd loved like a brother. Then he pressed a button on his desk phone. Send them in, he said. Everything Juliet thought she knew about her life is about to change. The door opened. Juliet's mother walked in, and Juliet had never seen Rosa look so destroyed. Her chef's whites were disheveled, her hair falling out of its usually perfect bun, her eyes swollen and red from hours of crying. Behind her came Catherine Phillip, still in the clothes she'd been wearing during the crisis, her makeup smeared, her hands trembling. Juliet. Rosa rushed to her daughter, pulling her into an embrace so tight Juliet could barely breathe. Mija, I was so scared. They told me what you did. They told me you broke in, and the guards chased you and you. Mama, I'm okay. Juliet hugged her back, breathing in the familiar scent of her mother's lavender hand soap and the industrial kitchen cleaners. I'm okay. Sophia's okay. Everything's okay. You could have been arrested. Rosa pulled back to look at her, hands gripping Juliet's shoulders. You could have been hurt. You could have. She could have done nothing, John Phillip interrupted quietly. She could have stayed in your apartment and let my daughter die while 15 doctors fumbled in the dark. But she didn't. Rosa turned to look at the billionaire, and Juliet saw fear flash across her mother's face. The deep, instinctive fear of someone who'd spent their whole life at the mercy of powerful people. But John didn't look angry. He looked humbled. Mrs. Martinez, he said, using Rosa's last name with a respect Juliet had never heard from anyone on this estate. Your daughter is the only reason my daughter is alive right now. The doctors failed. Security failed. I failed. His voice broke slightly. But Juliet, he stopped, composed himself. Juliet ran into a building full of people who saw her as a threat. She fought through guards who could have seriously hurt her. She grabbed a critically ill baby and administered a treatment that went against everything the medical experts were saying. She did all of that knowing that if she was wrong, it would destroy both your lives. She wasn't wrong, Catherine Phillip said softly. She stepped forward, and Juliet could see the tracks of tears on her face. She was right. She was the only one who was right. Catherine looked at Juliet, and there was something raw in her expression, something broken open. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for saving my baby when I couldn't, when no one could. Juliet didn't know what to do with the gratitude of rich people. She'd spent her whole life avoiding their notice, and now here they were, looking at her like she was something precious instead of something to be managed. I couldn't let her die, Juliet said awkwardly. Not when I knew what was wrong. Not when I could do something about it. That's exactly the point, John said. He stood up from his desk, walked around it, and did something Juliet never expected in a million years. He knelt down, a billionaire, on his knees, looking up at the cook's daughter. I've spent my entire life believing that money and education and connections were the only things that mattered, John said. I built walls around this estate to keep out people I thought were beneath me. I hired guards to protect my family from threats I imagined lurking outside. And the whole time, the real threat walked right through my front door, wrapped in silver ribbon and a pretty vase. And the only person who could see it was the girl I'd taught my staff to ignore. He reached out and took Juliet's hand. I was wrong about so many things. About what matters. About who matters. And I don't know how to make that right, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying. Thomas Mitchell was arrested the next morning. Juliet watched it happen from the nursery window, standing next to Sophia's crib while the baby slept peacefully. Police cars rolled up the driveway. Officers led a man in an expensive suit toward a waiting vehicle while camera flashes exploded around him. The story had leaked somehow. News vans lined the estate's perimeter, reporters shouting questions that no one answered. But the arrest was only the beginning. John Phillip didn't just want justice. He wanted demolition. Within a week, he'd mobilized an army of lawyers to dismantle everything Thomas Mitchell had built. The shell companies, the stock options, the board positions, the country club memberships. every piece of the empire that Mitchell had constructed on a foundation of resentment and betrayal. The charges are attempted murder of an infant, John told Juliet during one of their now daily conversations. The billionaire had taken to seeking her out, asking her questions about plants and healing, and the grandmother who'd taught her things that medical schools didn't know. Even white-collar criminals don't survive that in prison. Juliet nodded. She still wasn't entirely comfortable in John's presence. Still felt the weight of the class divide that had defined her entire life. But something had shifted between them. Something real. What happens now? Juliet asked. To the estate, I mean. To everything. John smiled, a tired smile but genuine. Now, he said, we tear down the walls. He meant it literally. Over the following weeks, Juliet watched as construction crews dismantled the imposing fences that had surrounded the Phillip property. The guard towers came down. The staff-only signs disappeared. The service entrance was sealed, and a new main entrance was built, one that everyone used, regardless of their position. But John wasn't done. There's going to be a medical center, he announced at a press conference that Juliet watched from the crowd, standing between her mother and Catherine Phillip. A free clinic, open to everyone in the community, focused on accessible care that combines evidence-based medicine with traditional healing knowledge. It's going to be staffed by doctors who know how to listen, who know how to look at the whole picture instead of just the test results, who understand that wisdom comes from many sources. He paused, and his eyes found Juliet's in the crowd. It's going to be called the Rosa Martinez Wellness Center, named after a woman who worked tirelessly for 9 years to give her daughter opportunities, and who raised that daughter to be brave enough to save a life when it mattered most. And it will honor the memory of Juliet's abuela, whose knowledge passed down through generations ultimately saved my daughter's life. Juliet's vision blurred, her mother's name on a building, her grandmother's legacy recognized. Real people would receive real help because of something abuela had taught her on a concrete porch in Catania. Rosa was crying beside her, not the scared tears of worry about rent and job security. These were different. These were tears of someone realizing that their sacrifices had meaning. There's one more thing, John said into the microphones. He announced a scholarship fund, full tuition to any university in the world for Juliet and for other students from underprivileged backgrounds who showed promise. He announced a house, not the garage apartment, but a real home on the property, with Juliet's name on the deed alongside her mother's. He announced a position for Rosa on the board of the new wellness center, with a salary that made her gasp when she heard the number. But for Juliet, the most important announcement was smaller, quieter. Something John said to her privately after the cameras left. I'm setting up a research apprenticeship, John said, with the best ethnobotanists and traditional medicine specialists in the world, if you want it, so you can learn everything your abuela didn't get the chance to teach you, so you can become the kind of healer she was raising you to be, but with resources she never had. Juliet thought about her grandmother, about the promise she'd made to use her wisdom when it mattered, about all the years she'd spent being ashamed of her inheritance, wishing she could be something more respectable. She'd been so wrong. Her abuela's knowledge wasn't something to overcome. It was something to build on, a foundation of wisdom stretching back generations, waiting for Juliet to add her own layer. Yes, Juliet said. I want that more than anything. John nodded. Then he did something that would have been unthinkable 2 weeks ago. He pulled Juliet into a hug, holding her the way she imagined fathers held their daughters. Thank you, he whispered, for being brave when it mattered, for being the person I should have seen all along. Juliet hugged him back. She wasn't invisible anymore. Juliet stood in front of a building that bore her mother's name. The Rosa Martinez Wellness Center gleamed in the California sunshine, its glass walls reflecting gardens that Juliet herself had helped design, gardens filled with medicinal plants her abuela had taught her to recognize. Lavender for anxiety, chamomile for sleep, echinacea for immunity. And in one carefully controlled greenhouse, behind locked doors, a collection of toxic specimens used to train the next generation of doctors to see what 15 experts had once missed. Today was the grand opening. Juliet tugged at the collar of her new dress, a gift from Catherine, tailored to fit her perfectly. She still wasn't entirely comfortable in clothes like these. Part of her probably never would be. But she was learning that discomfort wasn't always bad. Sometimes it meant you were growing into a new version of yourself. You ready, Mija? Her mother appeared beside her. Rosa had transformed over the past year. Not just her clothes, Though those had changed too, the worn uniforms replaced by professional attire. But something deeper. The constant tension in her shoulders had eased. The worry lines around her eyes had softened. She stood straighter, spoke louder, took up space in a way she never had when she was just the cook. She was the director of community outreach now. She had an office with her name on the door. A staff. A voice in decisions that affected thousands of people. I don't know, Juliet admitted. There's a lot of people out there. Rosa smiled and squeezed her hand. There's a lot of people out there because of you, baby. They came to see the girl who saved a billionaire's daughter with activated charcoal and her abuela's wisdom. I had help. You had knowledge. You had courage. You had everything your abuela gave you. Rosa's eyes glistened. She'd be so proud of you, Mija. So proud. The crowd was larger than Juliet had expected. Hundreds of people filled the gardens. Families from surrounding neighborhoods who'd always existed in the shadow of wealth. Medical professionals from around the world who'd come to see this new model of healthcare. Journalists, photographers, camera crews, and there in the front row sat John and Catherine Phillip, with Sophia on Catherine's lap. The baby was thriving now. 17 months old, with chubby cheeks and bright eyes and a laugh that rang out across the garden. She'd hit every developmental milestone perfectly, showing no lasting effects from the poisoning that had nearly killed her. As Juliet approached the podium, John stood, leading the crowd in applause that washed over her like warm water. A year ago, this man had been a distant figure glimpsed through windows. Powerful, untouchable, belonging to a world she could never enter. Now he was something else. Not quite a father. Not quite a friend. But something in between, a mentor, a believer, a bridge between worlds. Juliet took the podium with trembling hands. She'd written a speech, practiced it dozens of times. But standing here now, looking out at the sea of faces waiting to hear what she had to say, the words felt wrong. Too polished. Too perfect. Too much like someone she wasn't. So she set her notes aside and spoke from her heart. My abuela's name was Carmen Martinez, Juliet began. She was born in Catano, Puerto Rico, in a house with no running water. She never learned to read English. She never finished school. By every measure our world uses to decide who matters, she was nobody. She looked at the building behind her, at her mother's name etched in stone, honoring her abuela's legacy. But she saved more lives than most doctors ever will. She delivered babies for mothers who couldn't afford hospitals. She treated fevers with herbs when there was no money for medicine. She knew things about plants, about the body, about healing, that she learned from her mother, who learned from her mother, who learned from generations of people who had to figure out how to survive when no one in power would help them. Juliet's voice grew stronger. She used to tell me that our knowledge was our inheritance. Not money, not property, not fancy degrees. Just what she put in my head, and what I would someday pass to my children. She said that knowledge was worth more than gold, because no one could ever take it away from you. She thought about the night she'd broken into the mansion, the terror, the certainty, the desperate prayer that she wasn't wrong. For a long time, I was ashamed of that inheritance. I wanted to be modern, American, sophisticated. I wanted to fit into a world that looked down on people like my abuela, that called her knowledge superstition and her wisdom ignorance. She shook her head slowly. I was wrong. Where I come from isn't something to escape. It's something to build on. The knowledge my abuela gave me saved a baby's life when 15 doctors with degrees from the best universities couldn't figure out what was killing her. That's not despite my background. It's because of it. Hope. She spoke directly to them. I know what it's like to feel invisible, to believe that your poverty makes you nothing, that the only way to matter is to become someone completely different from who you were born to be. Her voice rang across the garden. But I'm standing here today to tell you that's a lie. The things that make you different, your background, your culture, your family's knowledge, those aren't weaknesses to overcome. They're strengths to build on, perspectives the world needs, wisdom that gets passed down through generations of people who figured out how to survive when everything was stacked against them. She gestured to the wellness center. This building exists because a girl from a garage apartment knew something that 15 doctors didn't. It exists because knowledge matters, no matter where it comes from. And it's going to be a place where all knowledge is valued, where grandmother's remedies sit alongside surgeons' techniques, where we listen to patients instead of just testing them, where no one is invisible and no one's wisdom is dismissed. Juliet took a deep breath. My abuela used to say that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken in the body. It's about seeing the whole person, their history, their environment, their community, their soul. It's about treating people with dignity, whether they're billionaires or housekeepers. It's about remembering that we're all connected, all deserving of care and respect. She smiled, a real smile, the kind she used to hide. My name is Juliet Martinez. I'm the cook's daughter, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure that no one like me ever has to feel invisible again. The applause started somewhere in the back and rolled forward like thunder. Juliet stood at the podium as hundreds of people rose to their feet. She saw tears on faces she didn't recognize, saw children clapping with wild enthusiasm, saw her mother sobbing openly while John put a steadying hand on her shoulder. And then Sophia did something that silenced the entire crowd. The toddler squirmed out of her mother's arms, dropped to the ground on unsteady legs, and began walking, tottering with that uncertain gait of a child just learning to trust her own feet. Catherine reached for her, but John held her back, watching with wonder as his daughter navigated through the forest of adult legs. Sophia walked straight to Juliet. She stopped at the edge of the podium, looked up with those bright eyes that had once been clouded with poison, and raised her chubby arms. Up! Juliet stepped down and lifted Sophia into her arms. The baby immediately snuggled against her chest, one small hand fisting in Juliet's dress. Juliet, Sophia said clearly, her version of Juliet's name. Juliet. The crowd lost its collective mind. Juliet held the baby close, feeling Sophia's heartbeat against her own. Strong and steady and alive. This child who had almost died in her arms was now saying her name, reaching for her, trusting her completely. This was what mattered. Not the fancy building or the scholarship or the house with her name on the deed. This, a life saved. A connection made. A bridge built between two worlds that were never meant to touch. Juliet looked at the wellness center with her mother's name on it. She looked at Rosa, standing tall and proud. She looked at John, the billionaire who'd learned to kneel. She looked at the crowd full of people who'd come to witness a new kind of legacy. And she thought about her abuela, somewhere beyond the veil, watching her granddaughter stand in the light at last. Thank you, abuela, she thought in Spanish. I kept my promise. I used what you taught me when it mattered. And I'm going to keep using it every single day for the rest of my life. Sophia gurgled happily and patted Juliet's face with a sticky hand. Juliet laughed, a real laugh, free and joyful and completely unguarded. She wasn't the girl in the margins anymore. She was Juliet Martinez, healer, bridge builder, her abuela's granddaughter. And her story was just beginning. Remember, you are not invisible. Your background is not a limitation, it's a foundation. The knowledge you carry, the wisdom your family gave you, the perspective that comes from your unique experience, the world needs all of it. One person can change everything.